the subverters of the socialist and communist ideologies. When people hear about socialism, they tend to think about the USSR and other totalitarian socialist experiments that happened in places such as China, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, and Cambodia. However, the true origins of the words socialism and even communism represent different values from what is represented by these governments. Communism, for example, represents a government whereby all its citizens have equal stake in the economic resources of the nation and equal political influence over government. A government meant to signify equality among all people should clearly be a democratic rather than an authoritarian government. And so, ideological communism has never been truly implemented by the so-called communist states that were previously discussed. The true historical forces that produced the words communism and socialism are not what we are led to believe today, especially after these concepts were heavily demonized throughout the Cold War. It is an unwritten fact that authentic ideological socialist or communist doctrine has never been put in practice since totalitarianism and the suppression of civil liberties, which are contrary to true socialist and communist ideology, tend to be the hallmark of socialist states from the USSR to Vietnam. The reality is that throughout the early 19th century, workers, soldiers, laborers and peasants throughout Europe started to popularize the idea of forming a government that served their interest as opposed to a government ruled by a monarch and a parasitic nobility class which contributed no form of productivity to society. The political ideas that the people gravitated towards were that of socialism and communism. In fact, the idea of communism can be traced back to Jesus Christ, and the word communion is where we get the word communism from, because Jesus gave an equal piece of bread to his disciples in order to symbolize the equality of each and every child of God. Communism is the politicization of the ideology of Jesus Christ, since Jesus advocated wealth redistribution, social and gender equality, anti-materialism, eliminating class structures, a wealth ceiling and equal justice. So, how did the concepts of communism and socialism become synonymous with atheism, authoritarianism, terror, ineffective productivity, and state suppression of civil liberties? When did these concepts change to represent what we now associate them with today? This video seeks to identify individuals who played a role in subverting the political ideology of the common man, from that of freedom, cooperation, and equality to that of inequality, atheism and absolutism. In order to understand this gradual doctoring of the concepts of socialism and communism, here are 10 notable subverters of the socialist and communist doctrines, who knowingly or unknowingly betrayed the popular revolution. Number 10. Karl Marx. Karl Marx himself can be seen as the original subverter of the ideas of socialism and communism. This potential is rather made convenient to him, because his work is widely cited as the articulated documentation of the will and aspiration of the people who identified with the concepts of socialism and communism, concepts which existed even before the birth of Marx himself. Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and in it he made a personal adjustment to the idea of communism which excluded theocracy. Marx openly recognized the popularity of religion among the majority of the people by describing it as the opium of the masses. However, Marx personally felt the need to superimpose his personal views about religion on the emerging communist and socialist ideologies that were just being structured into coherent ideologies at the time. By alienating religion from communist ideology, Marx clearly did not recognize the will of the people in that regard, and therefore any deviation from public opinion, much less one so significant, can be classified as a form of subversion of the spirit and intention of socialist and communist ideas of the time.
What many people don't know about Karl Marx is that his real name is Moses Mordecai Levy, and that he is suspected of being associated with high society organizations that intended on rewriting socialist and communist ideas in a manner that would pacify its growing popularity among working-class people in 19th-century Europe. One of these counter-revolutionary organizations was the Communist League in London, which aided Marx in the publication of the Communist Manifesto in 1848. This is why many traditional socialist thinkers saw Marx as a revisionist, who doctored traditional socialist views with the implicit intention of making it unappealing to the masses of the working class.
Many cite his introduction to the Communist Manifesto as another evidence of this claim, as it is introduced as something to be feared in an anarchical manner. During Marx's time, the main criticism made against socialist and communist revolutionaries was that their revolutionary methods would lead to anarchy. so it is very suspicious that Karl Marx, who was well aware of this popular criticism, would start his Communist Manifesto with an anarchical tone. Another less overt subversion that many identify within Karl Marx's work is his use of the term dictatorship of the proletariat, which is used to describe a state where the proletariat achieves absolute control over the functions of the state. However, the very use of the word dictatorship and the subsequent development of socialist dictatorship have led many to speculate that Marx may have used the term to create the option for future socialist leaders to justify establishing a dictatorship if socialism was ever successful in forming a people's government. To the masses who are predominantly uninformed about the intent of communism or the substance of Marx's work, they could be misled into accepting a communist dictatorship under the guise of following literal Marxist doctrine. In fact, Lenin would later use the term dictatorship of the proletariat to mislead the Russian working class into accepting a dictatorial government, although the vast majority of socialist and communist revolutionaries envisioned a more representative, democratic and decentralized form of government. This is why Lenin holds our number 9 spot on this list. Number 9. Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin, or Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, is widely remembered as a Russian revolutionary who overthrew the Tsar of Russia to implement history's first socialist state guided by Marx's ideology. However, it is important to note that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR for short, is not the first socialist state in history. That title goes to the Paris Commune, which was formed in 1870 in France and achieved the socialist vision by decentralizing authority and giving power to the people. Although it was crushed by military means, the example lives on, proving that a socialist people's government can work beyond theory. After the Russian Revolution, which occurred in order to end the undemocratic power of the Tsar, the workers and soldiers formed local councils in an effort to decentralize power and make political authority more accessible to the people. However, after the Bolsheviks secured power, the constituent assemblies, factory councils, labor unions and other socialist institutions that was developed by the people who were guided by socialist and communist ideology, were all destroyed so that power could be concentrated in the Politburo and in Lenin as its commissar. Clearly, such an outcome is a contradiction to the will of the people, and so, socialism was heavily discredited when the USSR identified as a socialist state, while embracing an absolutist rather than a democratic form of government. To make things worse, the USSR was less democratic than its competitive capitalist countries. If everyone is equal, then a dictator would constitute the reinstating of a ruling class in a communist society. This is a blatant violation of the decentralization of power which is required in order to destroy the class structure of a post-revolutionary society. As it was, Lenin and the Politburo became the new ruling class and the communist revolution was subverted from within. This is more overtly cited as the greatest betrayal in the history of the development of socialist thought because it forever discredited the idea of socialism and prevented its global popularity and appeal to working-class people around the world. The main criticism levied by the West against socialism, especially throughout the Cold War, was its lack of free and fair elections, its failure to transfer power in a timely manner, its lack of recognition of civil liberties, and state control over press. All of this is a product of how Lenin personally implemented communism in Russia, and this was never written down or agreed on that a socialist government would deprive its citizens of liberties. Especially since it was intended on being a people's government. In fact, other socialist revolutionaries harshly criticized Lenin for this deviation from socialist values. One such figure was Karl Kautsky, who infamously questioned the democratic values of the USSR under Lenin and Lenin's legitimacy as a voice for the global socialist revolution. Number 8. Joseph Stalin. Stalin is arguably one of the biggest subverters of the socialist ideology, as he oversaw the most discredited socialist government in all of history. His totalitarian ruling style was the opposite of what was expected by Russian socialists, many of whom still had a desire to decentralize power even after Lenin tried to regularize authoritarianism. Stalin doubled down on Lenin's betrayal of the democratic aspirations of socialism, and in doing so, became the very ruling class that the revolution wanted to replace. Stalin was euphemistically referred to as the Red Monarch, as he managed to amass the authority traditionally bestowed to monarchs. The working people of Russia and throughout Europe envisioned that Russian socialism would be the platform from which world revolution could be propelled, but Lenin and Morsa Stalin ruined that aspiration by marketing socialism a tyrannical and inefficient governing system, which is unable to eliminate the need for an upper class.
Чтобы они в своей работе не спускались до уровня политических обывателей.
Instead, the political elite became the new ruling class, and the class struggle became a political struggle against the state. The USSR's decision to ally with socialist-hating Nazi government in invading Poland is another subversion from socialist ideology, which sees the ruling class as the oppressor, not other nations. It is the intention of traditional socialism that poor and working-class people would rise up throughout the world, and unite in forming governments that serve their interest, and not the interest of a parasitic elite. By attacking Poland as a nation, and not its ruling class in particular, the USSR under Stalin betrayed the socialist expectation and sent poor and working-class people in Russia to fight and kill poor and working-class people in Poland. The war also forced socialists and working-class people to unite as a nation and fight other European nations, which subverted all socialist efforts of a European-wide people's revolution. And so, avoiding war was the best way for the USSR to spread the socialist revolution throughout Europe and preserve working-class solidarity. Number 7. Benito Mussolini. Many people know Mussolini as the founder of Italian fascism, and the dictator who closely collaborated with the Nazi regime. However, what many people don't know was that Mussolini was an ardent socialist who was many times arrested because of his socialist views. However, Mussolini would enter the annals of socialist traitors by renouncing his commitment to socialism, and developing a nationalistic rather than a class-based political movement that would eventually rival socialism. The practice of subverting socialism from a struggle between the haves and have-nots, to that of an ideology that unifies a nation regardless of rich and poor, is one of the many tactics used by the political elite of Europe in order to focus the people's revolutionary energy from challenging the wealthy elites in their own country to rivaling enemies from so-called foreign countries. World Wars I and II were partially encouraged in order to divide the European working class on the lines of nationalism, so that they would identify on the lines of nationality rather than social or economic class. Because socialism aimed at uniting the working people of the world, in order to jeopardize solidarity between working people from different countries throughout Europe, there had to be a cause which encouraged them to unite with their nation's elites against the working and ruling classes of other countries. It has surfaced over the years that Mussolini and even Hitler were funded by capitalists in Europe and America in order to counter the socialist revolution that had supposedly already taken place in Russia. What many historians fail to place adequate emphasis on is the fact that fascism was funded in order to counter socialism and its wide popularity among the working class of almost every country in Europe. Germany, for example, had a strong socialist movement, and even carried out a socialist revolution in the years after World War I. The German elite, with help from overseas sources, funded the Nazi regime in order to stifle and root out socialism in Germany. That is why Nazi ideology was originally written to oppose Soviet socialism from 1921. Mussolini once described fascism as corporatism, revealing fascism's roots in protecting the economic elites, or as socialists would describe it, the bourgeoisie. Mussolini's imperialist ambitions also bears stark contrast with the values of the socialist revolution, which seeks to liberate the oppressed and establish equality among humans. Additionally, Mussolini's colonial ambitions were contrary to the values of grassroots socialism, which he embraced anyway by identifying with fascism and its nationalistic theme. Number 6. Adolf Hitler. As discussed before, the transition of the socialist cause from that of a class struggle between the rich and poor, to that of nationalistic struggle against other nations, was pioneered by Benito Mussolini. However, the German fascist, Adolf Hitler, took it a step further by masquerading fascism as a branch of socialism. The term National Socialism was used in order to associate Nazism with the popular socialist movement that the majority of German people aspired to. However, a close assessment of Nazi ideology and traditional socialist ideology bears not the slightest resemblance. For the average German who simply associated the term socialism with the class struggle that they desired, and did not take the effort to differentiate National Socialism from traditional socialism, the Nazi Party in its outlook seemed like one of the many socialist parties operating in Germany after the First World War. One of the most well-kept secrets of history is that the Nazi Party was funded by rich industrialists and globalist bankers who wanted to use fascism as a bulwark against the rising socialist tide throughout Europe. After the Bolshevik Revolution, many capitalists, monarchists and other elites feared that a similar revolution might take place in their country. And so, the fear of the Red Terror began, with the elite circles of multiple countries forming networks and working together to undermine the socialist revolution. Under the threat that they and their family might end up brutally executed like Tsar Nicholas, his wife, and his 5 children, the ruling class of Western nations band together and funded Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Many historians have wondered how the Nazis were able to build one of the most formidable war machines in history after the nation went bankrupt after the First World War, as a consequence of the Treaty of Versailles. Today, it is widely known that famous Nazi collaborators such as Fritz Thyssen, Alfred Krupp, Henry Ford, Axel Wenner-Gren, Charles Beddoes, Roland Harriman, the Rockefellers, the British and Dutch royal families, and the Union Bank of New York under George Herbert Walker, Averell Harriman, and Prescott Bush, all had a hand in building up the Nazi regime. Corporations such as Coca-Cola, IBM, Standard Oil, Royal Dutch Shell, Ford Motor Company, BMW, AT&T, Kodak, Siemens, Bayer, and the Associated Press, all collaborated with the Nazis and helped Hitler build his war machine. The use of Nazi Germany as an opposition to socialism would explain why level-headed industrialists, CEOs, media barons, and billionaires would support an anti-Semitic regime headed by an irrational extremist, with less than favorable appearance. Socialism threatened the wealth of these elites, since its main promise was the redistribution of wealth, and the status of wealthy would not be permitted in a socialist state. Number 5. The Kim Dynasty. Kim Il-sung and his successors Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un have subverted the principles of socialism in possibly the most overt and openly chastised manner. The Kim dynasty capitalized on Marx's embracing of atheism and cultivated an atheistic regime that would eventually recognize them as gods. Since the basic tenets of socialism require equality among men, a leader of a socialist state proclaiming himself to be a demigod and a head of state for life, is no doubt a contradiction to the equality and democratic values that authentic socialism endorses. Additionally, forming a dynasty in what should theoretically be a democratic socialist state with shorter tenures than traditional democracies, free and fair elections, with the leaders chosen by merit, is an unignorable contradiction and a blatant subversion of the authentic socialist doctrine of equality in the affairs of government and its leadership. Very few governments in history have been socialist, and even fewer have been able to bastardize the concept of socialism like North Korea has done. The concepts of socialism and communism are severely discredited when countries like North Korea are identified as being socialist or communist. To that ends, the reputation of the ideology that the majority once identified with has been irreparably damaged, and many in the West instinctively shun the idea of socialism and communism due to the intentionally failed experiments of North Korea and the other totalitarian socialist states. Number 4. Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong not only subverted socialism by overseeing a socialist dictatorship, but also oversaw a phony cultural revolution that sought not to reform Chinese culture to align with socialist values, but to consolidate autocratic power synonymous to that of Joseph Stalin. The idea of a cultural revolution that endorses socialist reform is expected to deliver a society with less emphasis on inequality, materialism and competition, and more emphasis on cooperation, welfare, and collective compassion. However, Mao Zedong destroyed these hopes for the Chinese people when he instituted a phony cultural revolution and subverted the values of socialism to serve himself. The Cultural Revolution led to mass surveillance, a police state, the elimination of any traces of civil liberties and the elimination of traditional Chinese cultural values, to the detriment of the Chinese people. This no doubt makes Mao Zedong one of the subverters of grassroots socialist ideology. Number 3. Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro is possibly the most widely received communist leader in history and has possibly the best reputation among a group known for their despotism. However, even Castro, who many saw as mirroring the tenets of socialism, also subverted socialist veils to his own ends. Just like the Kim dynasty, Castro also formed a communist dynasty when he handed power to his brother. The establishment of a dynasty is unquestionably contrary to the values of a state which upholds the values of equality, democracy and meritocracy. The mistake by Castro to form a communist dictatorship and to form a communist dynasty has been a tragic blow to Cuban socialism and socialism in the Western world in general. Ever since Castro's rule, Cuban politics has had an autocratic tone, which has had detrimental effects on the suffrage and civil liberties of Cuban citizens. Number 2. Xi Jinping. If capitalism is the rival of the socialist system of government, then Xi Jinping stands apart from other communist leaders as being the biggest contributor to the maintenance of the modern capitalist and consumerist system. China has become the factory for the global consumerist culture, and Yankee capitalism has been its biggest beneficiary. For a theory based on class struggle on behalf of the poor, Xi Jinping's version of socialism sees Western billionaires getting richer, and the practice of amassing disproportionate amounts of wealth becoming a customary occurrence in communist China, so much so that China was responsible for 182 of the 479 new billionaires in 2020. Xi Jinping's government even assists in floating the U.S. economy by amassing government bonds and loaning Chinese wealth to the deindustrialized U.S. economy. Xi Jinping stands out, even among socialist subverters, as stretching the economic ideas of wealth redistribution to its furthest limits. Today, China cannot declare itself to be a proponent of traditional socialist values by embracing inequality, the suppression of civil liberties, and the enslavement of the people for cheap goods to be consumed by the capitalist West.
Number 1. Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev is remembered as the last premier of the Soviet Union, and actually oversaw its dissolution in 1991. Gorbachev's betrayal of socialist and communist doctrines were more symbolic than ideological, in that his posture of being receptive towards Western values, and his willingness to reform in order to meet the expectations of the capitalist West, to the point of the Soviet Union collapsing, gave the impression that capitalism had triumphed above communism and socialism. The Soviet Union has always been portrayed as theoretical communism put in practice, and America has always been portrayed as the epitome of Western capitalism. Therefore, the apparent victory by capitalism, and the subsequent dissolution of the Soviet Union, has always been used as evidence that communism is not workable beyond theory, and that the capitalist system is more practical to that of socialism and communism. Gorbachev's conduct towards Reagan and his willingness to compromise on Reagan's terms, signaled a subordination of the traditional socialist movement to the system that it was meant to challenge. Capitalism's apparent victory over communism significantly decreased the global popularity of socialism and communism by forever affirming the position that capitalism, and its inequality, is superior to socialism, and therefore should be favored by governments around the world. By associating socialism and communism with the Soviet Union, the USSR was seen as the real-world experimentation of traditional communist and socialist principles, which from past assessment shows that the USSR failed miserably at abiding by traditional socialist principles. And so, the fall of the Soviet Union was seen as a sign that traditional socialist and communist ideologies failed, and that nations should never experiment with those ideas again. This widely held view of socialism is not challenged by the fact that some of the most progressive nations today are in fact socialist countries. The ending of the Cold War in America's favor, and the passive and defeated conduct of Mikhail Gorbachev, subverted socialism and communism to the status of ideologies that have been tested and failed, even though authentic socialism and communism have never been implemented in the real world. Gorbachev's subversion of socialism is that he forever associated socialism with its apparent failure to triumph over capitalism or to operate in the real world. This video is not in defense of, nor is it a proponent of socialism. However, it seeks to correct the misconceptions about socialism, and vindicate the concept from the gross misrepresentations that it has been subjected to over the centuries by so-called proponents of the revolution. It is important to understand the traditional and authentic doctrine of socialism and communism, and its relationship to the struggle of working-class people to formulate a political ideology to serve their needs and aspirations. Since the popularization of socialism in its traditional form, the common people have always gravitated towards it, and every working-class revolution championing the cause of the common man has always been a socialist revolution. Even the Haitians instinctively executed a socialist revolution without being intimately acquainted with the socialist movement in Europe. And so, people have always seen traditional socialism and communism by extension, as an instinctive political movement that arises anywhere that the people speculate about what type of system truly serves their interest. Therefore, regardless of one's personal political outlook, the history, content, and purpose of the socialist and communist ideas must be understood in order to grasp humanity's historical struggle with the tyranny of inequality, despotism, and exclusionary classism. Authoritarian communism is an oxymoron. Communism embraces equality, while authoritarianism embraces inequality. Therefore, it is contradictory in nature for an authentic communist state to have an authoritarian political system. Toreno D. Beckford.